No one knows where he's buried. In 1227, after a lifetime of war, survival, and conquest that defied every odd the world had stacked against him, Genghis Khan died. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old, ancient by the standards of a life lived entirely on campaign. The exact cause remains one of history's most debated questions. Some historians point to injuries sustained after falling from a horse. Others suggest a lengthy illness, possibly contracted during the brutal Western campaigns. A few historical accounts hint at assassination. One Mongolian tradition even suggests he was wounded by a captive Tangut queen in an act of revenge. The truth, like so much about this man, has been swallowed by time and protected by the loyalty of those who served him. But what happened to his body is perhaps the greatest mystery he left behind. His remains were carried back to Mongolia by a procession of warriors, and according to accounts passed down through generations, everyone they encountered along the route was killed. Not out of cruelty, but out of cold, deliberate purpose. No witness, no trail. No way for anyone, enemy or pilgrim, to follow what came next. He was buried somewhere in the landscape that had made him, the Mongolian steppe, the same wilderness that had nearly consumed him as a boy of 9. And then, silence. His soldiers rode their horses across the burial site, over and over, until the ground was indistinguishable from the thousands of square miles surrounding it. Some accounts say a forest was planted over the grave. Others say a river was deliberately diverted to flow across it. One tradition holds that the burial party was itself killed afterward to eliminate the last witnesses. For 8 centuries, the greatest minds in archaeology have searched. Satellites have mapped the terrain from orbit. Expeditions funded by governments and universities have combed the Mongolian hills with ground-penetrating radar and soil analysis equipment. The grave of the man who conquered half the world has never been found. He came from the earth, and to the earth, without a trace, he returned. Genghis Khan died as he had always planned, with a succession in place. He had divided his empire among his sons, with his third son, Ögedei, designated as Great Khan, the supreme authority over the whole. It was a characteristically calculated decision. Ögedei was not the most militarily gifted of his sons, but he was the most politically adept, the one most capable of holding together a coalition of powerful, ambitious brothers who each commanded enormous armies and enormous egos. For a time it worked. Under Ögedei, the empire continued to expand at a pace that would have seemed impossible without the founder's direct hand. The Jin dynasty of northern China, which had been grinding toward defeat for years, finally collapsed. Korea was subjugated. Campaigns pushed deep into Persia and the Middle East, and then the armies turned west. Subutai, perhaps the greatest military mind the Mongol Empire ever produced, the same general who had previewed Europe a decade earlier, was given command of the Western campaign. What followed was a military operation of staggering ambition. The Mongol armies swept through Russia in winter, deliberately choosing the frozen season, when rivers became highways for cavalry. City after city fell. Vladimir, Ryazan. Kiev, then one of the most magnificent cities in the Christian world, was reduced to ashes and bones in 1240. A traveler who passed through years later described finding nothing but skulls. Then Poland, then Hungary. The Mongol forces split, simultaneously defeating a Polish-German army at the Battle of Legnica and crushing the Hungarian king at the Battle of Mohi within 2 days of each other, operating hundreds of miles apart with a coordination that the Europeans couldn't comprehend. They reached the Adriatic Sea. They were raiding into Austria. The kingdoms of Western Europe, France, the Holy Roman Empire, England, had no military force capable of stopping what was coming. But then suddenly, Ögedei Khan died. By Mongol law and custom, the great generals had to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai, the council to elect a new Great Khan. Subutai packed up his maps. The armies turned east. Western Europe never knew how close it came. The kingdoms that would go on to shape the modern world, the nations whose descendants would build the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, survived not because of their own strength, but because of a death in Mongolia. History sometimes turns on the smallest hinges. But if his body disappeared, his impact did not. At its height, The Mongol Empire was something the world had never seen and has never seen since, a single political authority stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. And within that vast conquered space, something unexpected began to emerge. Connection. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, was a period in which the trade networks crossing Asia became safer and more active than they had ever been in human history. The Silk Road, which had always been fragmented, divided between competing kingdoms, plagued by bandits, disrupted by wars, was now protected under a single imperial umbrella. A merchant with the right documentation could travel from China to Constantinople without crossing a hostile border, and merchants did, in enormous numbers. The Venetian explorer Marco Polo made his famous journey to China along these roads in the 1270s, a journey that would have been essentially impossible without the connectivity the Mongol Empire provided. His account of what he found there, the wealth, the sophistication, the sheer scale of Chinese civilization, electrified Europe and helped ignite a centuries-long hunger for direct trade with the East that would eventually drive the age of exploration. Columbus, sailing west in 1492, was partly looking for a sea route to the lands Marco Polo had described. The Mongol Empire had been gone for over a century by then, but its shadow stretched all the way to the New World. Ideas traveled those roads alongside goods, mathematical concepts, astronomical knowledge, paper-making techniques, printing technology, flowing between China, the Islamic world, Persia and Europe in volumes and at speeds that simply hadn't been possible before. Scholars who would never have encountered each other's work found themselves reading translations of texts from the other side of the known world. The intellectual cross-pollination that the Mongol trade networks enabled helped lay the foundations for some of the most significant developments in human history. The European Renaissance, the flourishing of Islamic science, advancements in medicine and navigation that would reshape civilization for centuries to come. A man who never learned to read, who spent his life on horseback crossing a vast wilderness, helped make the modern world possible. But the impact of Genghis Khan didn't stop at culture, trade, or politics. In 2003, a landmark genetic study made a discovery that a specific Y chromosome lineage, passed from father to son, was found in approximately 16 million men across a vast swathe of Asia, from China to Central Asia to the Middle East. 16 million men sharing a single common male ancestor. The lineage traced back to Mongolia, approximately 1,000 years ago. The researchers concluded that the most likely explanation was Genghis Khan himself, or his close male relatives. The scale of the Mongol conquests and the number of women taken into Mongol households, the particular privileges accorded to the Khan and his sons, all pointed to a single conclusion. Genghis Khan is, in the most literal biological sense, the ancestor of roughly 0.5% of every human being alive on Earth today. No other individual in recorded history comes close. However, we cannot tell this story honestly without examining the other side of it. The campaigns of Genghis Khan were devastating on a scale that is genuinely difficult to process. Modern historians estimate the death toll of the Mongol conquests somewhere between 30 and 50 million people. As a proportion of the global population at the time, it represents one of the largest demographic catastrophes in history, comparable to the Black Death that would sweep Europe a century later. In Central Asia, entire cities were not just defeated but deliberately, methodically erased. The great irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, networks of canals and waterways that had supported agriculture in the region since the dawn of civilization, since the very birth of human cities, were destroyed during the Mongol campaigns and never fully rebuilt. Land that had fed millions for millennia reverted to desert. The Islamic Golden Age, a period of extraordinary intellectual flowering in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, was effectively ended by the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258. The House of Wisdom, one of the greatest repositories of knowledge ever assembled, was destroyed. We will never know what was lost in those libraries, what cures, what discoveries, what ideas that might have changed the course of human history. Gone, because a city refused to surrender and were punished. 8 centuries later, the world still cannot agree on what to do with Genghis Khan. In Mongolia, he is everything. His face is on the currency. His name is on an international airport. A colossal stainless steel statue of him on horseback, 40 meters tall, visible for miles across the steppe, stands at the site where, according to legend, he found a golden whip as a boy, an omen of future greatness. He is the father of the nation, the greatest Mongolian who ever lived. In Iran and Iraq, the regions that were Khwarezm and Persia, the memory is entirely different. The name carries the weight of catastrophe, of cities burned, of populations destroyed, of a civilization interrupted so violently that it took centuries to recover, and in some ways never fully did. In China, the legacy is complicated by the fact that his grandson, Kublai Khan, went on to found the Yuan dynasty, ruling China not as a conqueror standing outside it, but as an emperor embedded within it. The Mongols in China became Chinese. The conquerors were absorbed by what they had conquered, in one of history's most remarkable reversals. In Russia, Mongol rule, the period known as the Tatar yoke, lasted for over 2 centuries and left marks on Russian culture, language, and political psychology that historians still debate. Some argue that the autocratic tendencies of Russian governance, the emphasis on centralized power, and the submission of the individual to the state bear the fingerprints of 200 years of Mongol dominion. One man, one lifetime. And the echoes are still shaping the world. So where does that leave us? Was Genghis Khan a monster, a genius, a force of nature too large for moral categories to fully contain? A catastrophe the world is still recovering from, or the unlikely architect of a connectivity that helped birth the modern age? The honest answer is that he was all of those things, simultaneously, without contradiction. He was a boy who should have died on the steppe and didn't. A man who took everything the world threw at him: abandonment, starvation, betrayal, captivity, defeat, and converted it into the largest empire in human history. He was also responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people, for the destruction of civilizations that had taken centuries to build, and for a trail of ruin that stretched from the Pacific to the Adriatic and took generations to recover from. He was not a hero. He was not simply a villain. He was something the human story produces very rarely, a figure of such enormous scale that he bends the arc of history itself, for better and for worse, in ways that are still unfolding. Somewhere in Mongolia, in a location no living person knows, he lies in the earth he was born from, unmarked, unfound, as if the land itself is keeping one final secret. But his mark is everywhere. In the trade routes that connected East and West, in the genes of 16 million living men, in the borders of nations that were drawn in the aftermath of his empire, in the fears and the pride of peoples who have never forgotten what his might nor his wrath. The boy who was given nothing changed everything. And 800 years later, in a world he could never have imagined, shaped in ways he could never have predicted, we are still, inescapably, living in the world he made.